These 2 weeks in reading, we're going to be going over chapters 8 and 9, in which both of them deal a lot with promoting comprehension in your classroom. Comprehension is a matter of readers interacting with the reading factors and the text factors of whatever it is that you are going over, whether it's a story or whether it's a book or whatever reading. And in the little vignette at the beginning of chapter 8, Ms. Alley is the teacher, and her class is reading a book that I'm fairly familiar with called Joey Pigza Loses Control. And it is a realistic fiction book. And she has the students reading either on their own or with a partner. And the book is on an independent reading level for her class. She's already assessed that to see, to make sure that the book is easily read. It's on an independent reading level. And she gives them sticky notes. She starts to pass out the copies of the books, and has sticky notes with the books. And on the sticky notes, they record their thinking while they're reading, like I said, either by themselves or with a partner. And the class then comes together after they read a chapter, and they talk about it. And they use charts that she writes on while she's talking about it, where she's kind of dividing what they have to say into different categories. In doing this, I'm talking about using some type of graphic organizer. It depends on what you've just read. Could be like a KWL chart, could be what the characters were doing, and over on this side, what we think that will lead to, like a cause and effect chart. Could be literally any kind of a graphic organizer chart. And then the students use what they put on those charts and talked about, and their sticky notes that they were keeping together, and they write in like little double entry journals. Actually, what she's using in the little vignette is triple entry journals. And whenever she goes through to see what it shows, the summarizing of what they've been reading in those journals, she figures out that her students kind of overall are not really summarizing very well. So she does a mini lesson, and she teaches a summarizing strategy as she reads aloud in sort of an interactive reading lesson, with the students. And then they read the rest of the book, and they have grand conversations about it, and they reuse their charts and their notes, and they write short little essays or writings about a related topic, in this instance about how the adults in the book were basically showing that they loved the child, and whatever it is that they tie into the book. And there's one little boy in it that even talks about how amazing it is what they know about the book. And whenever you think about that, I want you to remember what it says on page 255 in your textbook, because in the middle of page 255 it talks about that comprehension is the goal of reading. We've talked about that in class before. It's the ultimate goal of reading. It is the reason why people read. Look at that again. It's the reason why people read. Students must understand what they're reading to learn from the experience. As a matter of fact, it goes on in that paragraph to end with, struggling readers, in contrast, are frustrated. They don't understand what they're reading, they don't like to read, and aren't likely to choose to read in the future. Think about that. If you're not understanding what you're reading, if you're not really and truly comprehending what's going on in the reading, are you really going to want to read Are you really going to want to continue reading? Are you really going to want to seek out reading? Think about that. We're trying to build lifelong readers, and if we're not really trying to hone in on their comprehension, we're going to lose them. It goes into talking about on what comprehension is. And I like that it actually kind of defines it as that comprehension is a creative, multifaceted thinking process in which students engage with the text. Notice it said multifaceted thinking process in which students engage with the text. We've heard that word process before, haven't we? We know that process is not just a single action. Process is a series of behaviors or a series of actions that lead to a certain outcome. We learned about that when we were going through the steps of the reading process and the steps of the writing process, and we made the little flip book in class. And as we go on talking about comprehension, we look at the fact that comprehension involves the four levels of thinking. It's on a very literal level. Remember, we always go back to thinking the levels of Bloom's taxonomy, right? The very literal, the very basic level, picking out main ideas, putting things in sequence, looking at similarities and differences, looking at very explicitly stated things. The most bottom level of knowledge. Then we move into kind of in the inferential level, using clues and context, picking out implied info, tying it in to a student's background knowledge so that they can start making inferences. Then we move up to the critical level, analyzing kind of symbolism or symbolic meanings, distinguishing fact and opinion, drawing conclusions. What do you think was happening in this, what in the mood or the tone that the author has set in this paragraph? And then, of course, the highest level of thinking, the evaluative levels, readers assess. And again, I put this together, and of course, I have the S left off of assess. The value of the material, I can't tell you how many times I've done that. They can detect bias, faulty reasoning, effectiveness of persuasive writing, and judge quality. This is something I've talked about several times. If you get them to a place where they can actually make value judgments on how they feel about the outcome of the story, how they feel about how the character is reacting in the story, you've got them at a very high level of thinking. And then I added in here that a lot of this is determined by how much time that you give students in like sustained silent reading time, or how much time you spend reading aloud to them, or how much time you devote to letting them have those grand conversations to discuss what you all are reading. Whenever students are using reading strategies to comprehend the text that they're reading, and that's what that teacher was doing. She was using all these different reading strategies. And I hope that you'll be sure to look at the articles that I've loaded in to the module for these 2 weeks, because it's all about the strategies that you'll be using to help teach comprehension. It can't do anything but help them become better at comprehending. And I went ahead and I put in pages on this, because on page 260 it talks about activating background knowledge, helping your students activate their background knowledge. 261 is about making those connections to what they already know. 261 also talks about determining importance. 262 to 263, as a matter of fact, there's a really good chart on 263 about drawing inferences. Page 263, evaluating. Remember, moving them up in the different levels of comprehension. Page 264 talks about monitoring their own comprehension. 265, predicting. 265 also has questioning. Page 266 has helping themselves repair their own thinking as they go through. Nope, I must have been wrong on that. That kind of thing. Page 266, setting purposes for your reading. 266 is also about summarizing. 266, visualizing. Ways to teach comprehension strategies. There are super charts on pages 267 to 271 and 271 in your book that I'm really hoping that you'll look at. And one of the reasons that I have chapters 8 and 9 put together, other than obviously they both have to do with comprehension, between pages 299 and 319 in your book includes all of these strategies, but like activities to go along with them. And it even has it divided into narrative text, expository text, and understanding poetry. So I really, really hope that you'll go back and you'll look at those along with the articles that I loaded into these 2 weeks. As I mentioned earlier when I first started talking about this, comprehension is dependent upon the interaction of reader factors and text factors. When we're talking about reader factors, it has everything to do with the pre-reading activities that you do. Anything that you bring in, photos, videos, picture books, using different websites, like visual field trips or virtual field trips, looking at artifacts, like in social studies, letting the kids dramatize what's being read. Any of these experiences all help build their background knowledge so that they can use that reader factor of their background knowledge to connect to what is reading or what they're reading. Pre-teaching keywords is a prerequisite. Vocabulary. We talked at great length about over the last 2 days about the importance of building students' vocabulary in order to develop fluency, and that fluency and the vocabulary all together is what helps lead into comprehension. I've got fluency in here again, what we've gone over the last 2 weeks. I remember little things about teaching fluency can be repeated readings, can be reader's theater and acting it out, can be using poetry for the rhythm part of it to help build fluency. All of these comprehension strategies that we've been talking about, like predicting and questioning and setting purposes and visualizing, the summarizing that the teacher was doing in the little vignette that I mentioned, any type of connecting, all of that between pages 259 to 267 will help lead to comprehension. Comprehension skills or activities that you would have, learning activities that you would have students do, like noticing similarities and differences, putting things into the proper sequence, choosing a good title, identifying topic senses, matching up cause to effect. Those are all the learning activities that you can use to help build comprehension. And again, I've got strategies and I've got the skills or activities. Please, please, please learn the difference, that the strategies are what you are using as a teacher to build comprehension. The skills or activities, the learning activities, are what the students are using or doing in order to build comprehension. And of course, one of the things that this chapter talks at great length about is motivation, which is so much up to you. It's very intrinsic. There's a lot of factors that relate to it, but I promise, and we're going to be talking about that here in just a few minutes, and it mentions it in your book between pages 281 to 285, that the teacher is the biggest factor that contributes to the motivation of students in building their comprehension. Readers have to make those connections, as I mentioned already. And readers make 3 different types of connections between the text and their background knowledge. You've got to remember these. You've got to be able to describe these because you're not only going to be asked to do this when you're doing your PPAT during student teaching, but when you are doing the writing portion of your OSAT, whether you're early childhood or whether you're elementary, it is going to be very important that you are understanding that to build your students' comprehension in their reading, that you are trying to help them link ideas as in text to self, like where they are connecting what's going on and what they're reading to their own lives, text to world, where the students are actually relating what's going on in the text to what they know about the world, and then text to text, and that's really good stuff, where they're linking what they're reading in the text to another story, possibly something else that they have read. That is huge. And when you get them to that point where they're actually even connecting to something they've already read before, they are really beginning to make true connections. We mentioned text factors before, but text factors, structures, play a huge part in students' understanding. When it comes to narrative text, stories, informational books, narrative and expository text, I guess I should say. Stories from narrative text, informational books that are expository text, and even poetry can be easy or difficult to read depending upon how students understand them. If you have done lessons on different genres, if you've presented big broad categories to them, helping them to understand the different text factors that they'll come across in historical fiction, or the different factors they'll come across in realistic fiction. Think back to children's literature, for goodness sake. The different things that the different text factors in fantasy and science fiction, all those different little things that I was asking you to do with those different genres in children's lit. That has to do a whole lot with getting kids to understand text factors from the different genres. When we're talking about the text structures, that's the organizational patterns. Remember back whenever I talked about text structures of content area textbooks and understanding those unique structures in textbooks, like words in bold print, topic headings, the things that are written up at the sides of the pages, looking at the little diagrams or the insets. Those are all text structures in content area textbooks. Text structures in storybooks or narratives, of course, would be understanding the characters, the plot, the setting, where the climax is, the rising and the falling action that we've talked about. Text features, like I mentioned earlier, knowing about headings or layout or indices, or understanding literary devices that we've talked about before, like what a hyperbole is, or the idioms, or the similes and the metaphors and so forth. All of that has so much to do with students' understanding or comprehension. By the way, when you begin chapter 9, pages 290 to 293, has a really great vignette with 4th graders learning about frogs, and the teacher is making sure to move them through all of these different text factors. When we're teaching about text factors, of course, teachers are going to help students understand text factors by doing all the little mini lessons that teach all of those different strategies that are mentioned throughout these 2 chapters, or in the reading that I'm asking you to do, whether in the text or whether the little extra articles this week. has a lot to do with the way that you work during read alouds. Whenever you stop and you say, what is that? And the students are picking up on the fact that you have taught a mini lesson about picking out onomatopoeia, and you just read it in your read aloud, and they go back and they pick up on that onomatopoeia that you just read. Using think alouds to demonstrate all these strategies, that's exactly what I'm talking about here. Giving the students time to read independently, making sure that you teach all of those literary devices, making sure they're recognizing all those text factors. That's what you do to help the students get there. Whenever we're talking about the text factors of fiction, again, with the narrative genres, we're talking about knowing the different genres, like as I mentioned before, knowing the differences between like the folklore or the fantasy or the realistic fiction or the historical fiction or so forth and so on. Understanding the formats of stories, like the differences between what we would see in picture books or how chapter books are divided up. Think back to Children's Lit again. Elements of story structure, I mentioned it just a few minutes ago. Knowing how to pick out plot, characters, setting, point of view, the theme. Understanding about how we understand what is dialogue, the way that it's offset and the way that it is punctuated, the imagery that the author is presenting. Like I said, foreshadowing. What do you think's about to happen? The suspense, the symbolism, the tone. There's a lot about that on page 295. I hope you'll go back and look at. Pages 299 to 306 has all those different ideas. Remember that I mentioned earlier about teaching plot and characters and setting and point of view and theme and so forth. When we're talking about the text factors of nonfiction, of course, factors are organized in a particular way called expository. I talked to you about the structures of content area textbooks, the sequence, the comparison, the cause and effect in textbooks or in true stories, nonfiction, being able to pick out problems and solutions. There's a really good chart on page 309 that sets up all of those that you really need to take a look at. When you're helping students find those headings and subheadings, when you're helping them use those photographs, which can be used as artifacts and drawings, figures, maps, tables, margin notes, as I mentioned earlier, the highlighted vocabulary, the words in bold print, being able to see how there's like a little review after each section, even in your own textbook that you're reading these 2 weeks, that has exactly what we're talking about here. All of those are things that you can draw attention to and that you can teach in many lessons so that your students will better comprehend what they're reading. Whenever you are assessing a student's knowledge of text factors or when you're assessing their understanding, you can do this easily through discussing the characteristics of genre in grand conversations with your classes, when you're having them respond in writing prompts, when you're having them use some of the literary devices that you've gone over in their own writing. That's so important. Having them writing poems modeled after poems, examples that you show them, using those graphic organizers or them making their own graphic organizers in order to help understand what they're reading. You can use that as informal. You can also use the close procedure that we've talked about in weeks past, and that I had things loaded into the different articles for you to read or videos for you to watch about how to use the close procedures. Using running records, using think alouds. I've mentioned before about using like poems for two voices. And of course even tests in order to assess your students' understanding. I mentioned earlier about how important your role is in students' motivation and how important their motivation is to their understanding. It talks a lot about the teacher's role in motivation on page 281. Your attitude, you showing excitement about what's being read, the community that you have nurtured in your classroom, whether or not you have set your classroom up to be like a vocabulary rich and book and story rich environment. Your instruction, when you are stopping to teach those little mini lessons that you can tell that your kids aren't picking up on in your conversations with them. And conversation is so important in those, when I keep talking about grand conversation, when I keep talking about letting them respond. And then of course rewards, and I'm not always talking about throwing a Tootsie Roll their way. I'm talking about all the positive feedback that you are offering. I mentioned to you guys last week when I was talking to you about, or maybe it was the week before last when I was talking to you about vocabulary, of the student teacher who was just teaching like her hair was on fire, and she would just get so excited about those big words that the students were using, or when they were using the vocabulary that they had gone over in their conversations about what was being read or in their own writing. And that was her serving as motivation for those kids to continue. It's kind of hard to underestimate or even overestimate the power of positive feedback from teachers. The students' role in motivation is important too. If students feel like they have little hope for success from you, then they're unlikely to be engaged in what's going on. Remember your attitude. If students are more engaged when working with their peers, instead of it always being put off on them, they're getting to respond with each other about what was read, like we talked about earlier. That leads to motivation. Whenever the students, whenever you're promoting their reading and letting them write about their reading, and they will be more likely to be motivated to read and to write, and giving them sometimes a little bit of their own choice on their writing topics or their reading. There's a bunch of assessment tools for motivation, for goodness sake, on page 284, and this book is actually the only place I have ever seen that. It's really worth taking a look. On page 285, please take a look at that, and I would ask that you review many times over the course of your career about capable and less capable students. It says that more capable readers do the following. They read fluently. They view reading as a process of creating meaning. They decode rapidly. They have large vocabularies. They understand the whole organization of stories and poems and nonfiction books, as I keep talking to you about. They use those comprehension strategies that I keep mentioning. They monitor their understanding as they read. And then I notice that it says similarly capable writers do the following. Again, they're putting the readers and writers together. They vary how they write depending on their purpose. They use writing process flexibly. They focus on developing ideas and communicating effectively. They turn to classmates for feedback on how they're communicating. They monitor how well they're communicating in that piece of writing. They use formats and structures that we've talked about how to set up the structures of whatever kind of writing they're doing. They postpone attention to mechanical correctness until the editing stage. It is so important to do that writing process with students so it just becomes second nature to them, and they understand that it's not about the mechanics of it until the very end. It's about putting all their thoughts down into writing, and the writing and the reading have to go hand in hand, remember. Again, I'll put on here one more time that when we're talking about strategies for increasing comprehension, that's when you're building their background knowledge. That's when you're helping them connect. You're setting purposes and determining importance of what you're reading. Drawing inferences, you're evaluating, having them predict, having them summarize like the teacher was doing in the little story this time. Setting up visualizing, for example, using character traits of the characters in the story to visualize what the characters look like. And the skills are the same thing as the learning activities, what the students are doing. The strategies are what you are doing. The skills or the learning activities are what they are doing. There's a big difference when you are talking about those in your OSATs or when you are talking about those on your PPAT, that you are able to determine the difference between what it is that you are doing and what it is that the students are doing. And these 2 chapters this week on comprehension had so much to do with that. They're actually enjoyable to read if you will apply them to what you will actually be doing in your classrooms, in your teaching, in your student teaching, for goodness sake. They're so important to what a teacher does. They're huge. And I hope you won't ever discount them or forget about that.